Lebanon and Hezbollah have agreed to a U.S. proposal for a ceasefire with Israel, a top Lebanese official told Reuters on Monday, as Beirut residents grapple with intensifying Israeli strikes. Ali Hassan Halil described the effort as the most serious yet to end the fighting. Halil is an aide to Nambi Berri, Lebanon's parliament speaker. Berri has been endorsed by Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran, and has been negotiating over a ceasefire. There was no immediate comment from Israel. Diplomacy has been in the spotlight in recent days. World powers have said the ceasefire must be based on UN Security Council Resolution 1701. It ended a 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. Under it, Hezbollah would need to move weapons and fighters further back from the Israeli border. Halil says Lebanon presented comments on the U.S. proposal and that all the comments affirmed the, quote, precise adherence to Resolution 1701. He says the success of the initiative now relies on Israel.
Prosecutors this week are expected to tell a judge how they think President-elect Donald Trump's criminal case should proceed in light of his election victory. Trump was convicted in May of falsifying business records to cover up a $130,000 hush money payment his former lawyer Michael Cohen made to porn star Stormy Daniels. The payment was made for her silence before the 2016 election about a sexual encounter she says she had with Trump, who denies it. Trump was scheduled to be sentenced November 26th, but Judge Juan Marchand last week put all proceedings in the case on pause at the request of Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg's office. Bragg is unlikely to aggressively seek to have Trump sentenced before the January 20th inauguration. That's according to a former prosecutor with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office who spoke with Reuters, though prosecutors may ask the judge to delay the sentencing indefinitely or propose delaying the implementation of any sentence until Trump exhausts all options for appeal, which could take years. Anna Kaminsky is a professor at New York Law School.
If the court goes forward with the sentencing, and if the court decides to impose sentence in this case, so if the sentencing is not delayed, or even if it is delayed, when and if the sentencing goes forward, the court has quite a few options to impose. So the first is a prison sentence, and that's highly unlikely. Even if Trump weren't the president-elect, even if Trump weren't a former president, just given the circumstances, the allegations of the case, who he is, all of those things go towards a non-incarceratory sentence or a sentence where he wouldn't be serving any prison time. What's more likely is that there would be a sentence that did not involve prison time, like probation.
Trump has long called the case a politically motivated attempt by Bragg, a Democrat, to interfere with his campaign. His defense lawyers have argued the case should be dismissed altogether, arguing that having it loom over him while he was president would cause unconstitutional impediments to his ability to govern. It would be up to the judge to decide what to do about the case after considering arguments from both prosecutors and the defense. Trump's lawyers had previously argued his conviction should be vacated and the charges dismissed because of a recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling. In July, the top court determined that presidents cannot be prosecuted over their official acts, and that evidence of their official acts cannot be used in trials over personal behavior. Bragg's office argued that their case dealt with purely personal conduct. The judge delayed a decision on this after prosecutors asked for more time to weigh next steps. It is not clear when or if the judge will rule on whether presidential immunity applies to the case.
Moscow has hit back at reports of a U.S. decision to allow Ukraine to fire American missiles deep into Russian territory. The Kremlin on Monday warned any such decision by President Joe Biden's administration would escalate the conflict and would mean Washington was directly involved. When asked about reports by the New York Times and Reuters on the decision, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov noted they were not based on any official statement. However, Peskov pointed to comments made by Russian President Vladimir Putin in September about such a proposed step. He said using NATO military infrastructure and personnel for the operation would mean the direct involvement of NATO, including the United States and European countries in the war in Ukraine. Peskov also said the outgoing US administration would be adding fuel to the fire and provoking tensions. Sources quoted in both the New York Times and Reuters reports presented the move as partly in response to the reported arrival of North Korean soldiers in Russia's Kursk region to help repel a Ukrainian incursion. Ukraine's seizure of a piece of the Kursk region marked the first use of US weapons on internationally recognized sovereign Russian soil since the 2022 invasion. Russian officials have cautioned the West against pressing the limits of what a nuclear power might tolerate. Putin has changed Russia's nuclear doctrine to say any conventional attack on Russia aided by a nuclear power would be considered to be a joint attack. In late October, Putin said his defense ministry was working on responses if the United States and its NATO allies helped Ukraine with long-range missile strikes.
President Joe Biden has lifted some restrictions blocking Ukraine from using U.S.-supplied weapons for striking deeper into Russian territory. The decision is a major change in U.S. policy and could help Ukraine better defend itself. But it could also escalate the conflict. Biden's decision to authorize long-range strikes could help defend Ukraine's foothold in Russia's Kursk region, which it seized as potential leverage in future war talks. Long-range strikes would also allow Ukraine to target Russian military air bases. James Nixie is the director of Russia, Eurasia, and Europe programs at Chatham House.
It is a dramatic step because it does give the Ukrainians the ability to hit really important military points and infrastructural points inside Russia. And that will absolutely have an effect on Russia's ability to wage war. But it won't win Ukraine the war outright, and certainly not in the immediate future, and not at all, to be perfectly honest with you. But the truth is that for Ukraine to win the war, we have to do an awful lot more to squeeze Russia than we are now. So it's an enormous step. The Ukrainians are hugely relieved, but it's not a game changer as far as the war is concerned.
Russia has strongly opposed the decision, insisting that Ukraine cannot carry out such strikes without NATO's direct help, and calling it a major escalation. On Monday, the Kremlin said that any such decision would signal direct U.S. involvement in the conflict. Here's Russian President Vladimir Putin himself in September, warning against such a decision.
If this decision is made, it will mean nothing less than the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, and European countries in the war in Ukraine.
The first Ukrainian long-range strikes could happen in the coming days. But with 2 months left in Biden's term, there's no way to know how long the new policy will last, as a new U.S. administration comes to power in January.
Obviously, this can be reversed by Donald Trump when he comes into power in February, and it looks likely to be, judging from the tweets and judging by his appointments. So there is the understanding that Ukraine needs to do all that it can between now and January, mid-January, in order to get itself into that best possible position, because it might well be more handicapped than it ever has been before come 20th January.
Trump has repeatedly criticized the scale of U.S. aid to Ukraine and has vowed to end the war quickly, without saying how. A Trump spokesperson did not immediately respond to a request for comment.
These bomb shelters are designed to protect against radiation and natural disasters, and they're now being mass-produced in Russia, the country's Emergency Ministry Research Institute has said. The announcement coming as US President Joe Biden's administration agreed to allow Ukraine to fire American long-range missiles deep into Russia, though the Research Institute did not link the production increase to any current crisis. The Cub-M shelter is said to defend against a variety of threats, including shrapnel, debris and fires. It can even be deployed in Russia's vast northern permafrost, according to the State Institute. A standard unit can hold 54 people, but additional modules can be added. The war in Ukraine is entering what some officials say could be its final, most dangerous phase. Moscow's forces are advancing at their fastest pace since the early weeks of the conflict in 2022, while the West is seeking to shore up Ukraine. On Tuesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a warning to the US, lowering the threshold for a nuclear strike. On Monday, the Kremlin called Washington's long-range missile decision reckless and said it would respond.
G20 talks in Brazil have reached a breakthrough on climate finance. That's according to diplomatic sources, who say that the world's 20 major economies have reached a consensus, but a fragile one. Wealthy countries have been pushing for richer developing nations, such as China and major Middle Eastern oil producers, to contribute to climate finance. The diplomatic sources say negotiators have agreed to a text mentioning developing nations' voluntary contributions to climate finance. But they stop short of calling them obligations. The development comes as diplomatic tensions over global warming spilled out into this week's G20 summit, following a failure so far to reach a deal in Azerbaijan at the UN's annual climate summit. Although the ongoing COP29 conference is tasked with agreeing a goal to mobilise hundreds of billions of dollars for the climate, it's actually the leaders of the group of 20 major economies, who are currently on the other side of the world in Rio, who hold the purse strings. Those 20 countries account for 85% of the global economy and are the largest contributors to the development banks helping to steer climate finance. Back in Baku, COP29 remains tasked with agreeing a goal for how much financing should be directed from developing countries, multilateral banks, and the private sector to developing nations. Economists told the summit it should be at least $1 trillion. But the breakthrough at the G20 over voluntary financing is overshadowed by the return to power of US President-elect Donald Trump. Trump is reportedly preparing to again pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement. His election throws into doubt how much money the world can muster to address climate change, possibly without the support of the world's largest economy.
The Sudanese families at a military-run shelter in the city of Omdurman survived their horrific siege by paramilitary forces in the country's devastating civil war. Mohammed Awed and his family fled Tuti Island, a community nestled at the confluence of the Blue and White Nile rivers just north of the capital, Khartoum. In the outbreak of fighting between the Sudanese army and a militia called the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF laid siege to the island.
There is no good food, and there's a lot of diseases. There is no sleep, no safety. Even if you want to cook at home, you don't have the money to cover the costs of food. We used to depend on charity kitchens, but they closed. We had nothing to eat.
Charity kitchens have been forced to shut down due to a lack of funding, and experts warn the island is among 14 places across Sudan at risk of famine. Sarah Siraj, a mother who escaped with her 2 children, recalls the horror as disease spread unchecked.
Lately, dengue fever was widespread in Tuti. The epidemic was very widespread, in the hundreds. We used to have 6 to 7 funerals each day. All old people. Food was bad. There was no food or medicine.
Activists report that the RSF charged people large sums to evacuate them. The RSF did not respond to a request for comment. At a shelter, nutrition guide Rabia Abdelgader has been treating families arriving in desperate conditions.
Sometimes the families eat 1 meal per day. That's why conditions of children here have deteriorated, their health as well. Their health is deteriorating.
A recent report estimates over 61,000 deaths in Khartoum state during the first 14 months of Sudan's war. It is significantly more than previously recorded.